The morning sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows of the downtown courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. The room smelled faintly of aged wood, leather-bound law books, and a hint of coffee left over from the previous late-night preparations. A low murmur of conversations echoed briefly before the gavel slammed down, silencing the room. The judge's voice, calm yet authoritative, called for order, and everyone immediately straightened, the heavy weight of the morning's proceedings pressing on them like a physical force. At the front of the room, near the prosecution's table, sat Rex, a large, well-trained police dog. His coat gleamed under the artificial lights, and his eyes scanned the room with an intensity that only a K9 could command. Rex's handler, Officer Thompson, sat beside him, keeping a steady hand on his companion's harness. There was a quiet discipline in the pair, a synchronization born of countless hours of training and service. To the seasoned officers and courtroom veterans, Rex represented professionalism and authority, the silent protector who could sense threats that humans might miss. To most others, he was simply a calm presence, a reminder of the law's weight and reach. Among the gathered audience was a small figure who seemed almost out of place in this serious environment. 4-year-old Emma, perched on her mother's lap. Emma's wide brown eyes darted across the room, taking in the towering judge, the flurry of papers carried by lawyers, and the various officers who filled the room with quiet authority. Her small hands clutched a worn stuffed bunny, its fur slightly matted from repeated affection. Emma's mother, Mrs. Sanders, sat nervously beside her, whispering occasional reassurances and adjusting the girl's coat. Though Emma was young, her natural curiosity was uncontainable. The courtroom's tension pressed on the adults, but she found herself drawn to something entirely different. Her gaze settled on Rex. She tilted her head, studying his shiny badge and the disciplined way he sat, perfectly still but alert. To Emma, the dog looked like a guardian from one of her storybooks, strong yet kind. She reached out a tiny hand, pointing toward him and whispering, "Doggy." Her mother smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair behind Emma's ear. "Yes, sweetie," she whispered back, careful not to draw attention. "That's Rex, the police dog." The proceedings had already begun in earnest. The case on trial was serious, the kind of legal matter that weighed heavily on families and the community. Testimonies had been long, punctuated by lawyers raising objections, and the judge enforcing decorum with an unwavering hand. The room was tense. You could feel it in the stiff shoulders, the quickened breath of spectators, and the furrowed brows of jurors. Every whisper, every shuffle of paper seemed amplified, bouncing off the tall ceilings in a way that made even small movements noticeable. Emma's small gestures went unnoticed by most adults. Her mother kept her close, whispering comforting words as the girl's eyes danced with curiosity. Emma's attention, however, was fixed entirely on Rex. The dog's posture was impeccable, ears slightly forward, eyes calm but alert, and his breathing steady. Every so often he would tilt his head slightly, as if acknowledging her attention. Emma giggled softly at the gesture, squeezing her stuffed bunny tighter. To her, it was a silent conversation, one that needed no words, one that felt magical amid the otherwise serious world around her. Across the courtroom, the attorneys debated heatedly, their voices firm and clipped. Witnesses fidgeted nervously in the stand, adjusting their clothing or clearing their throats before responding. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of pressure that made even minor mistakes seem catastrophic. And yet, amidst this storm of adult seriousness, a tiny ripple of innocence quietly stirred. Emma's pointing, her quiet fascination with Rex, formed a stark contrast to the tension around her. For the law enforcement officers present, Rex's calm demeanor was a testament to training and experience. But for the families in the room, especially those who had never been close to a police dog, his presence added an almost surreal layer to the scene. He was a figure of authority, yet there was something reassuring in the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his eyes seemed to watch without judgment. To Emma, he was simply a friend, a gentle giant who seemed to understand her in ways no human could in that moment. Emma shifted slightly on her mother's lap, her small hand now pointing more deliberately. "Doggy, watch me," she whispered, a soft giggle escaping her lips. Her mother chuckled quietly, adjusting Emma's coat and whispering back, "He's watching, sweetie. He's a very good dog." Emma's eyes widened in delight, and she clapped her hands softly, thrilled by the silent acknowledgement she imagined in Rex's response. The courtroom, meanwhile, remained immersed in its formal rhythm. Lawyers prepared exhibits, jurors adjusted their seating, and the judge maintained a steady cadence, guiding the proceedings with meticulous attention. But within the tension, subtle human moments like Emma's gestures and the gentle presence of Rex began to create microcosms of warmth. A faint smile flickered across the face of one juror, unnoticed by most, and the handler's eyes briefly softened as he observed the child's innocent interaction with his partner. It was in these quiet, almost invisible moments that the story truly began to take shape. While the trial's outcome, the testimonies, and the legal arguments were undeniably important, a different kind of story was unfolding in the background. Emma's curiosity, Rex's calmness, and the subtle acknowledgement between child and dog created a bridge between the adult world of rules, tension, and seriousness, and a childlike world of wonder, trust, and simplicity. Even the photographer from the local newspaper, perched near the back of the courtroom, caught a glimpse of the scene. She paused, camera resting on her knee, noting the gentle interaction. This small, humanizing moment, a child pointing at a police dog in the midst of a serious trial, was a story in itself. A story of innocence amidst formality, of warmth amidst tension, of the small but profound ways life reminds us to pause and notice simple joys. As the morning wore on, Emma's fascination did not wane. She whispered questions to her mother, pointed at Rex, and clapped softly when he responded to subtle cues from his handler. The courtroom, while still focused on the trial, began to carry an undercurrent of human connection, imperceptible yet powerful. The tension was still there, but layered atop it was the quiet reminder that even in the most serious places, moments of beauty, innocence, and connection could exist. And so the stage was set. The courtroom remained tense, the trial continued, and adults focused on the weighty matters of law and justice. But in the corner, Emma and Rex shared a silent bond, a tiny thread of warmth weaving through the room's seriousness. Little did anyone know, this small moment would grow, ripple, and eventually touch everyone present, altering the atmosphere in ways no one could have predicted. The trial dragged on, each passing hour layering tension upon tension in the courtroom. Witnesses shifted uncomfortably in the hot, polished wooden seats, lawyers adjusted ties and purses, and the judge's gavel struck repeatedly to maintain order. The words being exchanged were serious, technical, weighty, often difficult to comprehend for the untrained ear. But in the midst of it all, 4-year-old Emma remained focused elsewhere. Her gaze had locked onto Rex, the police dog seated a few feet from her. Every so often the K9 shifted his weight subtly, head tilting just slightly as if acknowledging her presence. To most adults, these nuances would go unnoticed, but Emma saw them as magical. She pointed again, whispering, "Doggy, hi," to her mother. Mrs. Sanders smiled nervously, brushing back her daughter's hair, careful not to attract attention. Emma's small gestures, pointing, clapping, whispering, were tiny rebellions against the heavy adult world surrounding her. As the prosecution called its next witness, the room seemed to tense even further. A middle-aged man took the stand, nervously adjusting his glasses. The attorneys pressed questions, their voices sharp and calculated. The man's answers were careful, deliberate, but there was a tremor in his voice. Murmurs swept through the spectators, and a faint smell of anxiety hung in the air. Emma, oblivious to the seriousness, fidgeted slightly, turning her head to watch Rex again. "Doggy nice," she whispered softly. The handler, Officer Thompson, noticed her gaze. He shifted slightly in his chair, giving a small, reassuring nod to the child. Rex responded instantly, sitting upright, his ears perking forward, tail brushing lightly against the floor. Emma giggled quietly, a tiny, delicate sound that contrasted sharply with the courtroom's rigid atmosphere. A few people glanced toward her, smiles flickering but quickly suppressed. It was remarkable, really, how one small human being could disrupt the tension, with nothing more than curiosity and delight. Emma's fascination grew as the witness recounted his story. Her small hands gripped her stuffed bunny tighter and she leaned forward, her eyes wide. Every few seconds she would point toward Rex, whispering something incomprehensible but full of excitement. The K-9, trained to remain calm amidst chaos, seemed to sense the child's wonder. He responded subtly to the handler's gentle cues, tilting his head, blinking slowly, and even wagging his tail lightly. To Emma, it felt like a conversation. To the adults, it was almost invisible, yet somehow, the mood of the room began to shift imperceptibly. The judge, noticing a ripple of suppressed smiles in the courtroom, briefly glanced down at the gallery. Emma's bright eyes and animated gestures were hard to miss if one was looking carefully. For a moment, the stern lines of the judge's face softened, though he maintained his authoritative composure. Even the lawyers, immersed in their formalities, caught brief glimpses of her small figure waving excitedly at Rex. It was a subtle reminder of humanity amidst the precise, controlled world of law. Emma's whispers grew bolder. "Doggy, sit," she said, almost as if instructing him. The handler leaned slightly forward, murmuring a quiet command. Rex responded instantly, adjusting his posture, ears pricked attentively. Emma clapped her hands softly, giggling with delight. A few spectators let out suppressed chuckles, and one older juror shook his head, smiling despite himself. There was something undeniably infectious about the innocence in her gestures, a reminder of life outside the courtroom, outside the weighty deliberations and adult conflicts. As the proceedings continued, Emma's small interactions became a subtle undercurrent in the room. Every so often she would whisper, point, or smile at Rex, and the dog's calm, patient responses created tiny ripples of warmth. Even the court reporter paused for a second, her pen hovering over the transcript, as she observed the unusual exchange. The courtroom, though still dominated by formality, began to feel slightly lighter, a testament to the quiet power of innocence. Emma's mother noticed the subtle shift too. "Emma," she whispered, "be careful, honey." But even as she spoke, her heart swelled with pride and affection. Her daughter had found something wonderful amidst the seriousness, a connection to a living creature who responded to her curiosity with patience and attention. It was a small rebellion against the gravity surrounding them, yet profoundly human. The witness on the stand noticed it too, though indirectly. He paused mid-sentence, glanced at the child pointing at Rex, and his nervous expression softened for a fleeting moment. He cleared his throat and continued, but a small, humanizing smile lingered on his face. Lawyers, ever focused on the details of testimony, occasionally stole glances at the pair. Emma's innocence, paired with Rex's calm demeanor, was a subtle yet potent force in the room. By mid-morning, the courtroom's atmosphere had undergone a quiet transformation. The heavy air, thick with tension, was now interspersed with brief moments of warmth. Emma's laughter, quiet but joyful, echoed softly against the tall walls, a gentle counterpoint to the stern voices of lawyers and officials. Her small gestures reminded everyone present, parents, officers, lawyers, and jurors alike, that beyond the technicalities of law, beyond the weight of testimony and verdicts, there was room for connection, empathy, and simple joy. Emma leaned forward once more, her tiny fingers pointing decisively at Rex. "Doggy, look," she exclaimed in her own excited voice. The handler gave a quiet nod, and Rex responded with perfect composure, his eyes meeting Emma in what seemed like an understanding gaze. The child's giggle filled the space again, catching the attention of a few more spectators. For a fleeting moment, the courtroom forgot its tensions. They were reminded, subtly but powerfully, of the gentleness that could exist even in spaces built for seriousness. It was a lesson in contrasts, the weight of law versus the lightness of childhood, the rigid discipline of a trained police dog versus the uncontainable curiosity of a young girl. Every observer felt it, consciously or not. Emma's innocent fascination had become a small undercurrent that touched everyone present, softening brows, prompting quiet smiles, and even influencing the rhythm of the courtroom. The trial would continue, and serious decisions still lay ahead, but in that corner of the room, a quiet bubble of warmth had formed. By the time the morning recess approached, Emma had become somewhat of a silent celebrity. The handler whispered something to Rex, who responded obediently, and Emma clapped her hands, delighted. Her mother laughed softly, trying to keep her daughter's energy in check. A few spectators whispered among themselves, noting the unusual and heartwarming interaction. The tension in the room had not vanished, but it had shifted subtly, infused with a fragile warmth, all because of the curiosity of a small child and the patience of a police dog. As the judge called for a short break, Emma waved shyly at Rex. The dog sat calmly, tail flicking slightly in acknowledgement. For everyone watching, it was more than just a child playing with a dog. It was a reminder that even in the most serious, formal, and stressful environments, humanity and innocence could quietly assert their presence. Emma had unknowingly begun a ripple that would touch everyone in the courtroom, a small spark of joy in the midst of stern authority. The courtroom hummed with tension as the trial progressed into mid-morning. The air was thick with seriousness, punctuated by the occasional shuffle of papers, murmured instructions from attorneys, and the measured tapping of the judge's gavel. Witnesses adjusted their positions on the stand, eyes flicking nervously to the gallery, while jurors leaned forward in attentive silence, absorbing every word of testimony. To the adults, the world consisted of rules, protocols, and heavy consequences. But to Emma, 4 years old and perched on her mother's lap, the world had shifted entirely to the front of the room, where Rex, the police dog, sat with perfect discipline. Emma's eyes followed him with fascination. She leaned forward slightly, her small hands gripping the edge of her mother's coat. "Doggy, watch me," she whispered, almost as if she expected him to respond verbally. Her mother smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face, careful to maintain composure while suppressing a laugh at her daughter's earnestness. Emma's gestures, pointing, whispering, subtle clapping, were becoming more animated, a natural response to Rex's calm, attentive demeanor. The K9 sat perfectly still, tail brushing lightly against the floor, eyes tracking her every movement. Something remarkable began to happen. A few spectators, initially preoccupied with the proceedings, noticed the small child's gestures. Whispers rippled quietly through the gallery. "Is that a little girl?" one juror murmured. "Look at the dog, he's actually paying attention to her," said another. Even the media photographers in the back of the room, their cameras poised to capture moments of significance, glanced up from their lenses, intrigued by the subtle, humanizing interaction unfolding before them. Emma's excitement grew. She pointed at Rex with determination, whispering, "Sit." "Good boy." The handler, Officer Thompson, chuckled softly and leaned down, murmuring a quiet command. Rex responded instantly, adjusting his posture to sit taller, ears pricked forward, eyes locking with Emma's in what seemed like acknowledgement. Emma clapped her hands softly, delighted, and let out a gentle squeal of joy. In the midst of a courtroom filled with tense faces, her laughter felt like a tiny sunbeam piercing through a stormy sky. The judge, presiding with his usual gravitas, noticed the small disruption. He raised an eyebrow and allowed himself a brief smile before returning to the case at hand. His clerk, seated nearby, suppressed a giggle, her fingers poised above the keys of the stenotype machine. Even the lawyers, though immersed in strategy and meticulous cross-examination, found themselves stealing glances at the scene. There was something captivating about the innocence of a child, the calm authority of a K9, and the unexpected bridge forming between them. The witness on the stand, a young man in his 20s, shifted uncomfortably under the judge's watchful eye. He glanced toward Emma and Rex for a split second and caught the tail end of the interaction. For a brief moment, he forgot the technicalities of his testimony. A smile tugged at his lips before he quickly composed himself. The courtroom's tension, which had been palpable for hours, softened imperceptibly, like a tightly wound string letting out a faint, soothing hum. Emma's gestures grew more expressive. She tapped her stuffed bunny against her chest, then pointed again at Rex. "Look, doggy, you see," she whispered excitedly. The handler leaned forward, giving a subtle hand signal. Rex responded instantly, sitting upright, muscles tense yet controlled, eyes locking with Emma's. The dog's calm, responsive presence seemed almost magical to her, and Emma's giggle rang out again, pure and unrestrained. The sound caught the attention of several spectators, who allowed themselves small smiles, their eyes crinkling in ways they hadn't since the trial began. The ripple effect spread. One juror shifted in his chair, smiling at the innocent exchange. A mother in the gallery whispered something to her child, who giggled in response. Even the courtroom officers, accustomed to tense, formal proceedings, exchanged brief glances, acknowledging the light-hearted human moment quietly. The press photographers, capturing images of testimony and exhibits, discreetly raised their cameras to immortalize the interaction between Emma and Rex. It was unexpected, but everyone could feel the subtle magic of the moment. Emma leaned forward, pointing with both hands now. "Doggy, play," she whispered, her voice soft yet filled with excitement. The handler patted Rex gently, who remained composed, tail swishing lightly. Emma's giggles, her innocent gestures, and Rex's disciplined responses had transformed her presence from background curiosity into a subtle focal point of the courtroom. Adults began to notice more overtly, exchanging quiet smiles or suppressed chuckles. The tension that had dominated the room for hours began to shift, just a little, moment by moment. Emma's mother, seeing the effect her daughter had unwittingly triggered, whispered softly, "Be gentle, sweetie." Emma nodded, eyes wide and gleaming, turning her full attention to Rex. The K9's eyes followed her movements, his patience unwavering, reinforcing the invisible bond forming between child and dog. Each tiny movement, a tilt of the head, a slight wag of the tail, seemed amplified in significance against the backdrop of serious proceedings. What had begun as a quiet, unnoticed fascination was evolving into something powerful, a reminder of humanity, innocence, and the quiet joy of connection. Even the lawyers found themselves subtly affected. One attorney, who had been delivering a particularly aggressive line of questioning moments earlier, paused mid-sentence, noticing Emma's delighted expression. Another suppressed a smile, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. It was a strange but undeniable shift. The innocence of a child had begun to pierce the weighty armor of authority, reminding everyone present that the human heart could not be fully contained by rules, procedure, or protocol. By mid-morning, the courtroom had begun to feel lighter, though the trial's gravity remained. Emma's pointing, whispering, and gentle clapping were a quiet counterpoint to the formality and tension surrounding her. Each small interaction between the girl and Rex seemed to create a ripple that touched the edges of the room. Jurors unconsciously straightened in their chairs, witnesses paused with softened expressions, and even the judge allowed a fleeting sparkle in his eyes before returning to the matter at hand. The media had begun to take notice. A journalist in the back scribbled notes furiously, recognizing the unique human element unfolding amidst the seriousness of the trial. "A child and a K9, she muttered to herself. "This could be a story on its own." Cameras discreetly clicked, capturing moments of quiet interaction. A giggle, a pointed finger, a patient dog. Emma's innocence was slowly becoming a focal point, her tiny presence bridging the gap between tension, discipline, and human warmth. As the morning progressed, Emma's confidence grew. She leaned further forward, speaking softly but with clear enthusiasm. "Rex, you sit, good doggy." The handler responded with subtle cues, and Rex obeyed perfectly, sitting taller, alert, and focused. Emma clapped, then gently tapped her bunny against her lap, squealing with delight. Her laughter, small but vibrant, seemed to echo off the high ceilings, a gentle counterbalance to the murmur of legal discussion, the shuffle of papers, and the ticking of time. It was remarkable, truly, how one small human and one disciplined dog could so subtly yet profoundly alter the energy of a courtroom. The trial would continue, serious and consequential, but in that corner of the room, a quiet bubble of warmth had formed. Emma's curiosity and joy had created something intangible yet powerful, a reminder of innocence, the gentle bond between humans and animals, and the subtle ways life could soften even the heaviest moments. As the mid-morning recess approached, Emma waved shyly at Rex, who remained seated, tail flicking slightly in acknowledgement. The courtroom staff, lawyers, and even jurors had absorbed the effect of the tiny interaction, each carrying a small fragment of warmth and amusement into the break. The ripple created by a curious child and a patient police dog was far from over. It was only beginning. What started as an innocent observation was growing into a story that would linger in the minds of everyone present, quietly altering their perceptions, reminding them of humanity amidst authority and innocence amidst the seriousness of the law. The courtroom felt heavier than usual that morning. Lawyers whispered briskly to one another, flipping through thick stacks of documents. Witnesses fidgeted under the scrutinizing gaze of the jury, and the judge's gavel struck sharply against the bench to maintain order. Every sound echoed off the high ceilings, emphasizing the tension that had been building for hours. Families leaned forward, gripping benches as if their very posture could hold back the weight of anxiety. The trial was serious, deeply consequential, and every detail, every word mattered. And yet in a small corner a different rhythm was quietly unfolding. 4-year-old Emma, perched on her mother's lap, had grown bolder. Her attention remained locked on Rex, the police dog who sat a few feet away, poised with quiet authority. The dog's deep brown eyes tracked her movements with perfect calm. Emma pointed excitedly, whispering, "Doggy, sit. Good doggy." Her tiny voice, full of joy and wonder, cut through the monotony of the courtroom in the gentlest way, like a soft breeze breaking through a heavy fog. Officer Thompson, Rex's handler, leaned slightly forward, giving a quiet cue. Rex responded immediately, sitting taller, his body taut with attention yet relaxed. Emma clapped her hands softly, her laughter spilling over in delicate bursts that contrasted sharply with the room's gravity. A few spectators, previously tense and absorbed in the trial, noticed the interaction. They exchanged brief smiles, some almost imperceptibly. The air, heavy with formality, shifted ever so slightly, as if the presence of innocence had begun to weave through the seriousness, creating small but undeniable pockets of warmth. Emma's mother whispered encouragement, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Good job, sweetie," she murmured, careful not to draw too much attention. But the subtle gestures, the pointing, whispering, clapping, were difficult to ignore entirely. A juror glanced down, momentarily distracted by the child's excitement. Another, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, suppressed a smile, her stern expression softening. Even the lawyers, steeped in technicalities and strategy, allowed themselves a fraction of amusement. The judge, presiding over the proceedings with his usual composed authority, noticed the ripple of reactions. His brow furrowed initially, but then a small, almost imperceptible smile appeared. He cleared his throat, signaling the witness to continue, but the tension that had dominated the room for hours had eased just slightly. Emma's innocent fascination, combined with Rex's calm responses, had begun to leave a mark on everyone present. The witness on the stand, a nervous man recounting a difficult experience, paused mid-sentence. His eyes caught the exchange between the child and the dog. For a fleeting moment he smiled, a small human gesture breaking through the layers of anxiety. Emma, noticing his reaction, waved her small hand shyly while whispering to her mother, "Doggy, see." The dog's tail flicked in response to a subtle command from Officer Thompson, as if affirming the connection. The courtroom, rigid and formal, felt lighter, as though the invisible weight had been momentarily lifted. Even the press began to notice. A photographer in the back, notebook poised, quietly raised her camera to capture the scene. A tiny girl giggling softly, pointing at a large, disciplined police dog who remained perfectly still yet attentive. The moment seemed almost cinematic, a brief interlude of humanity in the midst of strict formality. The journalist scribbled notes, whispering to a colleague, This could be a story on its own. Just look at her. Emma's confidence grew. She leaned forward slightly, clapping her hands together. "Good doggy, you sit," she said, her eyes gleaming with delight. The K9 responded instantly, adjusting his stance and tilting his head toward her. Emma giggled again, and this time her laughter was slightly louder, carrying across the courtroom. A few jurors exchanged glances, smiles creeping across faces that had been tense just moments before. The warmth was subtle, yet undeniably spreading. A mother sitting a few rows back leaned toward her child, whispering, "See, even grown-ups can't help but smile sometimes." The child giggled softly, watching Emma wave at Rex. Even the court officers, typically stoic and attentive only to procedure, allowed themselves a brief, knowing smile. The ripple created by Emma's innocence had spread further than she could have imagined, affecting not only those closest to her but others across the room. The judge called for another round of testimony, and the lawyers resumed their arguments, voices firm and precise. But even as the focus returned to the seriousness of the case, the previous minutes had left a mark. Emma continued her gentle interaction with Rex, whispering, pointing, and clapping softly. The dog, trained to remain calm in any situation, continued to respond to subtle commands from his handler, reinforcing the child's sense of connection and delight. One of the jurors, a man in his 50s, cleared his throat subtly and glanced down. He smiled faintly at the sight, the small girl with her tiny hands clapping, the large dog responding with impeccable discipline. In that moment, the weight of hours of tense deliberation felt lighter. Another juror shook her head, suppressing a chuckle, but her eyes sparkled. Even the stenographer allowed a small smile to tug at the corners of her lips, her fingers poised over the keyboard, as if the presence of joy momentarily reminded her of life beyond legal proceedings. The ripple effect grew. Emma whispered to her mother again, "Doggy, play." Her mother nodded, encouraging but careful. Officer Thompson gave a subtle hand signal and Rex responded immediately, tilting his head and sitting attentively. Emma giggled, jumping slightly on her mother's lap, clapping her hands. This time, more people in the courtroom noticed. Some murmured quietly to one another, whispering about the unexpected charm of the scene. For hours, tension had dominated the room, but Emma and Rex had created a pocket of lightness, a small reprieve that reminded everyone that even serious spaces could hold moments of joy. The witness continued, his voice calmer, his nerves eased slightly by the gentle distraction. Lawyers, still focused on their cases, occasionally stole glances at Emma and the dog. The judge maintained his authority, but the warmth of humanity had penetrated the rigid walls of the courtroom. It was subtle, yes, but palpable. The energy had shifted from tense monotony to something softer, richer, and more alive. Emma's mother whispered softly, brushing her daughter's hair. "You're being so good, sweetie. See how happy he makes everyone." Emma's eyes sparkled as she nodded, pointing once again at Rex. The dog responded with a slight shift of posture, tail flicking gently, ears attentive. Her joy seemed to multiply with every small movement, spreading like sunlight through the high, solemn courtroom. Even the most focused adults could not completely ignore the effect she was having. By the time mid-morning approached, Emma's interaction with Rex had become something of a quiet phenomenon. Families, jurors, and court officers found themselves smiling in ways they had not for hours. The press had taken notice, journalists scribbling notes, quietly photographing the gentle bond. The ripple created by Emma's innocence and Rex's calmness had grown, reaching the far edges of the room and subtly influencing everyone present. It was remarkable how a single child and a patient police dog could alter the energy of such a serious environment. The trial was far from over, with testimony and deliberation still weighing heavily on the courtroom. But in that small corner, a tiny spark of joy had ignited. Emma's curiosity and happiness had reminded everyone present of something essential, that even in spaces dominated by authority, law, and consequences, humanity and innocence could quietly assert themselves. As the judge called for a brief recess, Emma waved shyly at Rex. The dog remained seated, alert and calm, his tail flicking gently in acknowledgement. Families, jurors, and courtroom staff carried small fragments of warmth into the break. What had begun as an innocent curiosity from a 4-year-old girl had become something far more significant, a reminder that even in the most formal, serious, and rigid spaces, moments of joy and connection could flourish. The courtroom had been heavy with tension for hours. Lawyers whispered in urgent tones, flipping through stacks of case files, and witnesses shifted uneasily in the witness stand. The judge's gavel struck sharply, commanding silence, and the hum of anxious energy filled the room. Every movement seemed deliberate. Pens tapped pens, shoes shuffled quietly on polished floors, and jurors sat rigidly, absorbing testimony with furrowed brows. The weight of the case pressed on everyone present. Serious matters were at stake, lives and reputations intertwined with the legal arguments. And yet, amidst this storm of formality, Emma, 4 years old, perched on her mother's lap, had become a quiet focal point. Her wide brown eyes were locked on Rex, the police dog who sat attentively beside Officer Thompson. The dog's sleek coat glimmered under the overhead lights, his posture immaculate, every movement controlled yet responsive. Emma leaned forward, whispering excitedly, "Doggy, watch me." Her mother smiled softly, brushing her daughter's hair behind her ear, careful not to disrupt the courtroom order. The small gestures Emma made, the gentle pointing, the whispered encouragements, the occasional clap, had begun to ripple across the room. Jurors who had been tense moments ago were now stealing subtle glances, some allowing faint smiles to break through their otherwise serious expressions. One juror, a woman in her 40s, whispered to her neighbor, "Isn't that adorable?" Another juror, an older man with graying hair, shifted in his chair, a tiny grin breaking through the stern mask he had worn for hours. Even the court reporter, fingers poised over the stenotype, allowed herself a soft smile. Emma's enthusiasm grew. "Good doggy, sit," she whispered, her small hands clapping in delight. The handler leaned forward, giving a quiet command, and Rex responded instantly, sitting taller, ears forward, tail brushing lightly against the floor. Emma's giggles, soft and musical, carried through the room, creating a gentle counterpoint to the formal proceedings. What had begun as a quiet curiosity was now becoming a catalyst for subtle joy and warmth. The judge, presiding over the courtroom with his usual gravitas, noticed the shift. His stern gaze swept the gallery, and for a brief moment, his eyes softened as they fell on Emma and Rex. He cleared his throat to maintain authority but allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to tug at the corners of his mouth. The energy in the room, once oppressive, had been slightly lifted. Emma's innocent interaction was not disruptive in a formal sense, yet its impact was undeniable. Even the lawyers found themselves affected, though they tried to maintain composure. One attorney, mid-argument, paused for a fraction of a second, glancing at Emma's delight. Another suppressed a small chuckle, shaking her head in quiet disbelief. Their minds, trained to focus solely on evidence and procedure, could not fully ignore the gentle, joyful disruption caused by a child's curiosity and a dog's calm obedience. The courtroom's rigid atmosphere had softened, layer by layer, creating pockets of warmth that spread invisibly yet perceptibly. Emma's mother whispered softly, encouraging her daughter while keeping her voice low. "Be gentle, sweetie. Let's not get too excited." Emma nodded, eyes still wide, pointing at Rex once again. "Doggy, look," she exclaimed. The dog, responding to subtle cues from Officer Thompson, tilted his head and adjusted his posture. The connection between child and dog had become almost tangible, a small bond that radiated into the surrounding space. Even witnesses on the stand noticed it. One young man, mid-testimony, caught the exchange out of the corner of his eye. He paused, a faint smile forming as he observed the joy on Emma's face and the calm, obedient response from Rex. In that fleeting moment, the gravity of his testimony seemed lighter, and he exhaled quietly, regaining composure with renewed calm. The child's innocence was quietly influencing the emotions of adults, offering a brief reprieve from the intense pressure of the proceedings. The ripple effect was undeniable. A mother in the gallery leaned toward her child, whispering, "See, even adults can't help but smile sometimes." The child giggled softly, watching Emma clap her hands with delight. Court officers, who were accustomed to enforcing decorum and monitoring tense proceedings, exchanged subtle glances, their expressions softening. The ripple of humanity had grown beyond the mother and daughter in the corner. It had reached jurors, witnesses, staff, and even members of the media. The press, observing the subtle shift, began capturing discrete images. Cameras clicked quietly, documenting the innocence of a child interacting with a highly disciplined police dog. One reporter whispered to a colleague, This might be the human interest story of the trial. Just look at her." The scene was unusual, unexpected, yet it spoke volumes about the quiet power of empathy and connection in environments that often seemed impermeable to warmth. Emma's confidence continued to grow. She leaned forward, her small fingers pointing decisively at Rex. "Good boy, you sit," she whispered excitedly. The dog responded with flawless obedience, ears forward, eyes attentive. Emma clapped again, giggling with delight. Her laughter was no longer just a private joy. It had begun to resonate across the room, eliciting smiles and soft chuckles. Adults who had been tense for hours found themselves subtly relaxing, their shoulders easing, their expressions softening. The judge, maintaining control of the courtroom, acknowledged the subtle shift in energy. He presided over the proceedings with his usual authority, yet he allowed a quiet warmth to settle over the room. Emma's interaction with Rex reminded everyone present that even in spaces dominated by rules, seriousness, and high stakes, humanity could not be fully contained. The innocence of a child and the calm discipline of a dog were quietly bridging the gap between tension and relief, structure and joy. Emma's mother whispered encouragement once more. "Good job, honey, see. He's listening to you." Emma's eyes sparkled as she nodded enthusiastically, pointing at Rex. The dog, trained to respond with precise obedience, remained calm yet attentive, reinforcing the invisible bond forming between the child and the K9. Each small gesture, the pointing, the whispering, the gentle clapping, resonated beyond the immediate interaction, subtly influencing everyone in the courtroom. By mid-morning, the courtroom's atmosphere had undergone a quiet but noticeable transformation. The heaviness of the trial was still present, but interspersed with laughter, smiles, and the faint ripple of joy created by a child and a dog. Witnesses appeared slightly less tense, jurors shifted in their seats with lighter expressions, and even the most stoic officers allowed themselves small smiles. Emma's innocence and Rex's calm demeanor had become an invisible force, spreading warmth across the room without disrupting the legal proceedings. Emma whispered again, pointing excitedly. "Doggy, you're so good." Her mother smiled, gently adjusting her daughter's coat. The dog responded with the tiniest wag of his tail, alert but composed. Emma clapped softly, squealing with delight. The courtroom's focus, though still on the trial, had begun to include this small human moment. The adults present, whether consciously or not, carried fragments of this warmth in their hearts, softening the tension and reminding them of life outside the courtroom walls. Even the media reporters couldn't resist capturing the fleeting yet profound interaction. Cameras clicked, pens scribbled notes, and journalists whispered quietly about the unusual and heartwarming scene. Emma's presence, her innocent gestures, and Rex's disciplined responses were becoming more than a side note. They were a quiet story of joy, connection, and humanity unfolding in the midst of legal formality. As the morning session drew toward its next phase, Emma waved shyly at Rex. The dog remained seated, calm and attentive, responding subtly to Officer Thompson's cues. The judge's gavel struck once more, calling the room to attention, yet a sense of warmth lingered in the air. Emma's curiosity, laughter, and delight had created a small ripple of joy, subtly transforming the courtroom's mood. What had begun as an innocent observation had evolved into something larger, a quiet testament to the power of innocence, the bond between humans and animals, and the subtle ways even the most formal spaces could be softened. The courtroom was quiet, almost reverent, as the trial continued. Lawyers leaned over tables, whispering sharply to colleagues. Witnesses shifted nervously, trying to maintain composure, while jurors sat upright, absorbing every word with concentration that bordered on intensity. Even the judge, presiding with calm authority, seemed aware of the room's thick tension. Every sound, papers shuffling, pens tapping, shoes scuffing, felt amplified under the high ceilings. The atmosphere was heavy, a mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and formal authority. And yet, in one corner of the courtroom, a small spark of life persisted. 4-year-old Emma, perched on her mother's lap, had long since abandoned full attention to the legal proceedings. Instead, her wide brown eyes were glued to Rex, the police dog seated patiently beside Officer Thompson. The K-9, perfectly trained to respond to subtle cues, remained calm and alert, his gaze seemingly tuned to the child's every movement. Emma's tiny hands moved energetically, clapping softly, pointing, and occasionally bouncing on her mother's lap in excitement. "Doggy, look," she whispered, her voice bright and playful. Her mother smiled, brushing a stray strand of hair from Emma's forehead. "He's watching, sweetie," she said quietly, careful not to draw undue attention. But the subtle gestures, the pointing, the whispers, the gentle clapping, were hard to ignore completely. A few spectators shifted in their seats, discreetly observing the child and the dog. Officer Thompson, noticing the intensity of the interaction, gave a small, almost imperceptible hand signal. Rex responded instantly, adjusting his posture, tilting his head ever so slightly, and flicking his tail in controlled acknowledgement. Emma clapped, squealing softly, delighted by the response. In that moment, the weight of the courtroom's tension seemed almost suspended, replaced by the light, contagious energy of her innocent joy. A juror, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, quietly chuckled at Emma's delight. Another juror, a man who had been frowning with concentration, shifted slightly, a small smile tugging at his lips. Even the court staff, trained to maintain strict composure, couldn't suppress subtle gestures of amusement and warmth. The ripple of Emma's presence, combined with Rex's calm attention, was growing into a wave that swept silently across the courtroom. Emma leaned forward, clapping her hands together, and whispered, "Good doggy, sit." The dog responded immediately, moving into a taller, alert posture as if affirming the child's excitement. Emma giggled, her laughter musical, a stark contrast to the rigid formality surrounding her. A few spectators allowed themselves quiet smiles, and the press photographers, capturing testimony and exhibits, discreetly shifted their cameras to record this tender human moment. The judge, presiding over the proceedings with his usual measured authority, noticed the subtle change in energy. For a moment, his stern expression softened as he observed the child's fascination and the dog's disciplined response. He cleared his throat lightly, maintaining courtroom order, but his eyes revealed a small warmth. Emma's interaction had become impossible to ignore. The ripple she had created was now a tangible, emotional presence. Even the witnesses began to notice. A young man on the stand, recounting a difficult experience, paused mid-sentence. His eyes caught the playful interaction between Emma and Rex. A brief smile crossed his face and he exhaled, his voice regaining steadiness. The tension of the trial, oppressive for hours, seemed lighter for a fleeting moment, softened by the innocence of a child and the calm authority of a dog. The ripple effect grew. Emma's gestures became more animated. She waved her tiny hands, clapped softly, and whispered words of encouragement to Rex. "Good boy, watch me," she exclaimed. The dog, responding obediently, remained alert yet calm. The jurors, spectators, and court officers subtly absorbed the energy. Smiles spread quietly, eyes softened, and the heavy atmosphere of the room began to shift. The formal rigidity, once almost suffocating, now carried undercurrents of warmth and human connection. Emma's mother whispered gently, encouraging her daughter while ensuring she remained subtle. "Good job, sweetie. See, everyone is noticing how gentle and clever you are." Emma beamed, pointing again at Rex. The dog's attentive gaze seemed almost affectionate, acknowledging her excitement without breaking his disciplined composure. The combination of innocence, curiosity, and discipline created a uniquely heartwarming scene in the otherwise serious courtroom. Even the lawyers, focused on their cases and strategy, couldn't remain entirely immune. One attorney paused mid-argument, his eyes drifting toward the corner where Emma sat. Another allowed a small, suppressed smile as she observed the child's delight. For hours, tension had dominated the room, but Emma's playful focus had softened its grip, reminding everyone present that even in spaces dominated by seriousness and consequence, small sparks of joy could ripple outward. The courtroom staff noticed as well. The stenographer's fingers paused over her machine for a second, the clerk's eyes crinkled with suppressed amusement, and even the bailiffs exchanged subtle glances, acknowledging the warmth spreading through the room. Emma's small presence, coupled with Rex's impeccable discipline, had become an unexpected yet undeniable force, gently reshaping the emotional rhythm of the courtroom. The press photographers, discreetly capturing the interaction, whispered among themselves. "Look at her. Isn't that amazing?" one said softly. The scene, they realized, was more than a fleeting distraction. It was a testament to the quiet but profound ways innocence could influence even the most structured environments. Emma, with her tiny gestures and heartfelt joy, was reminding everyone present of something essential. Humanity could thrive even in the strictest, most formal settings. Emma leaned forward again, clapping her hands softly. "Doggy, good doggy," she whispered. The dog responded instantly, shifting his stance slightly, tail flicking lightly, ears forward, eyes locked on her. The room, previously dominated by tense concentration, now carried layers of warmth, subtle chuckles, and soft smiles. The jurors shifted in their seats, the witnesses adjusted posture with lighter expressions, and the staff allowed themselves small gestures of amusement. The ripple Emma had started had become a steady, gentle wave. By mid-morning, the courtroom's atmosphere had undeniably changed. The heavy air of tension had been punctuated by moments of laughter, smiles, and shared humanity. Emma's innocent curiosity had become a connective thread between jurors, staff, witnesses, and spectators. Every small gesture, the pointing, whispering, and clapping, resonated further, softening the stern atmosphere and infusing it with lightness. Even the judge, maintaining formal authority, allowed a quiet warmth to permeate the courtroom. The gavel struck to call attention, but the ripple of joy remained, subtly affecting everyone. Emma's interaction with Rex had become more than a private delight. It was now a quietly shared experience, a reminder of the power of innocence and the gentle influence of a child's unfiltered joy. As the morning session continued, Emma leaned on her mother's lap, whispering once more, "Doggy, you're so good." Rex responded with calm attentiveness, and Emma clapped softly, squealing with delight. The courtroom, while still focused on the serious matters of the trial, carried fragments of warmth and joy, a testament to how small human moments could transcend even the strictest environments. By the time the recess approached, Emma waved shyly at Rex, who remained seated, calm and alert. The ripple had grown into a wave, touching jurors, witnesses, staff, and spectators alike. The courtroom, once dominated by anxiety and formality, now carried an undercurrent of connection, warmth, and subtle laughter. Emma's innocence had left an indelible mark, quietly transforming the room and reminding everyone present that even in the most serious moments, humanity and joy could flourish. The courtroom had been tense all morning, thick with the weight of testimony, legal jargon, and the pressing importance of the trial at hand. Lawyers leaned over files, whispering strategic comments. Witnesses fidgeted nervously under the scrutinizing gaze of the jury. Jurors absorbed every word with intense focus, occasionally exchanging subtle glances of agreement or doubt. The judge's gavel struck methodically, attempting to keep the formal cadence of proceedings intact. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as though the very walls carried the seriousness of every decision being weighed inside. Yet in the corner of the courtroom, a small miracle of innocence unfolded. 4-year-old Emma, perched securely on her mother's lap, had long since shifted her attention from the complexities of legal argumentation to a far simpler, more joyful focus. Rex, the police dog. The K9 sat beside Officer Thompson, impeccable in discipline yet subtly responsive to the child's every gesture. Emma's wide brown eyes sparkled with fascination as she leaned forward, her small fingers pointing emphatically. "Doggy, look," she whispered, her voice bright and full of excitement. Her mother, smiling gently, adjusted her daughter's lap, whispering softly, "He's listening, honey. You're doing so well." Emma beamed, clapping her tiny hands in delight, squealing softly. It was a sound that seemed impossibly light against the otherwise serious backdrop of the courtroom, a musical counterpoint to the rhythmic tapping of pens and shuffling of papers. Rex responded almost immediately to Officer Thompson's subtle hand signals, tilting his head and sitting a little taller. Emma's giggles erupted in response, soft but joyous. For the first time that morning, the courtroom collectively seemed to exhale, the tension lifting fractionally, imperceptibly, yet undeniably. Jurors exchanged discreet glances, some smiling faintly, some shaking their heads in quiet disbelief at the charm of the scene. Even the court officers, trained to maintain strict composure, allowed themselves subtle smirks, recognizing the quiet miracle of a child's innocence in such a stern environment. The judge, presiding with a careful blend of authority and patience, could not help but notice the ripple of warmth spreading through the room. A tiny smile crept across his face, a small break in his stern demeanor. He cleared his throat to maintain formal proceedings, but the humanizing effect of Emma and Rex's interaction had already permeated the courtroom. The rigid lines of authority, the unspoken pressures of the trial, all softened, just enough to allow a sliver of lightness to enter. Witnesses, too, were subtly affected. A young man on the stand, recounting a particularly difficult moment, caught the playful interaction between the girl and the dog from the corner of his eye. A small, involuntary smile flickered across his lips. The burden of tension eased fractionally. Words came more smoothly, nerves steadied, and a tiny but meaningful human connection had formed in the midst of testimony. Emma's giggle, gentle and musical, had become an invisible balm, calming frayed nerves and easing the weight of the day. The ripple effect continued to spread. Jurors leaned forward slightly, smiling at each small gesture. One woman whispered softly to her neighbor, "Look at her, she's amazing." Another juror, a man in his 50s, shook his head with a quiet laugh, marveling at how a child could so effortlessly shift the mood of the entire room. Even members of the press, who had come to document the trial's serious events, lowered their cameras momentarily to watch, noting the unusual yet profound human moment unfolding. Emma, noticing the subtle reactions, grew bolder. "Good boy, Rex, sit," she whispered, clapping her hands. The dog responded perfectly, obedient yet gentle, his calm presence amplifying the child's joy. Emma's laughter, now slightly louder, carried through the courtroom, drawing the attention of nearly everyone. It was contagious. Smiles began to ripple, spreading quietly yet surely through the crowd. Witnesses paused mid-sentence to catch glimpses of the small scene. Jurors, furrowed brows relaxed, and the courtroom staff exchanged looks of quiet delight. The combination of Emma's innocence and Rex's disciplined responsiveness created a powerful emotional undercurrent. Adults who had been tense, focused solely on procedure and evidence, were reminded of the beauty of simple joy. The juxtaposition, the rigid seriousness of the trial and the playful delight of a child, highlighted something deeply human. For a moment, no one was thinking about verdicts, evidence, or strategy. All were captivated by the subtle magic of connection. A child, a dog, and the pure, unfiltered delight that could transform even the most formal of spaces. Even the lawyers found it difficult to remain completely detached. One attorney, mid-question, paused briefly, eyes flicking toward Emma. Her co-counsel suppressed a quiet laugh, shaking her head. The judge's stoic presence softened, and a small, knowing smile lingered on his face as he called for the next witness. The atmosphere had shifted almost imperceptibly, yet powerfully. Emma and Rex were no longer peripheral. They had become the heartbeat of the courtroom, drawing the attention and admiration of everyone present. Emma's gestures became more expressive. She waved her tiny hands, clapped softly, and whispered delightedly, "Good doggy, you're so smart." Rex responded with perfect discipline, ears forward, tail flicking slightly. The room seemed to lean in subtly, caught between formal proceedings and the simple joy radiating from the girl and the dog. Spectators, jurors, and staff alike were drawn into the quiet spectacle, allowing themselves brief, soft smiles. The courtroom's previous tension had softened significantly. A collective warmth had taken root. The press photographers, capturing the interaction discreetly, whispered in amazement. "Look at her. Look at how happy he makes everyone," one murmured to a colleague. The scene, they realized, was more than a momentary distraction. It was a story of human connection, innocence, and joy persisting even in the most structured environments. Their cameras recorded the tiny gestures, the soft giggles, and the attentive gaze of Rex, preserving what would become a defining, heartwarming image of the trial. Emma leaned forward once more, her eyes sparkling. "Doggy, you sit so nicely," she whispered, clapping in delight. Rex responded instantly, calm yet attentive. Jurors and witnesses, unable to resist the contagious energy, allowed themselves quiet smiles, some chuckling softly. Even the most disciplined adults felt the emotional warmth, acknowledging, consciously or not, the subtle power of innocence and the magic of human-animal connection. By mid-morning, the courtroom had been transformed. The previous atmosphere of tension and seriousness still lingered, but it had been punctuated by laughter, smiles, and soft murmurs of delight. Emma's innocence and joy, paired with Rex's disciplined responses, had created a shared human experience, knitting together jurors, witnesses, staff, and spectators in a quietly emotional way. The small gestures of a child had become an unforgettable force, softening hearts and bridging the gap between authority and empathy. As the judge called for a short recess, Emma waved shyly at Rex. The dog remained seated, calm, alert, and attentive, responding subtly to Officer Thompson's guidance. The courtroom, now infused with warmth and lightheartedness, carried the echo of her laughter, her pointed fingers, and the gentle connection that had formed. What had started as curiosity had become a wave of emotion, touching every individual in the room and leaving an indelible mark on the hearts of those present. The courtroom had changed. What had begun as a rigid formal space filled with tension, anxious glances, and hushed conversations had softened into something far more human. Lawyers continued their arguments, witnesses provided testimony, and jurors listened attentively. But beneath the formality, an invisible current of warmth lingered. The air was lighter, more connected, carrying subtle echoes of laughter and delight. The reason was small yet powerful. Emma, a 4-year-old girl, and Rex, a police dog with disciplined precision, had created something extraordinary. Emma, perched on her mother's lap, waved softly at Rex, who remained seated, calm, attentive, and ready for any cue. Her tiny hands clapped gently, her eyes wide with fascination and delight. "Good doggy, you sit so nicely," she whispered. The dog's ears pricked and he shifted subtly, tail flicking lightly in acknowledgement. The simple exchange had become a centerpiece of the courtroom, a quiet symbol of innocence meeting discipline, joy meeting seriousness. The judge, presiding over the trial with careful authority, allowed himself a small smile as he glanced toward the pair. He cleared his throat to resume proceedings, but carried a quiet awareness of what had transpired. Even the sternest adults in the room, trained to focus solely on procedure and evidence, had been softened by the child's presence and the dog's calm attentiveness. In subtle ways, Emma's interaction had reminded them of something essential. Humanity, empathy, and the quiet joy of connection can persist even in the strictest environments. Witnesses, too, had been affected. The young man testifying paused mid-sentence, his voice lighter, nerves eased by the gentle distraction of Emma and Rex. Another witness, a woman recounting her experience, allowed herself a soft smile as she noticed Emma clapping quietly. The courtroom, which had once carried a heavy, almost oppressive weight, now contained moments of laughter, shared smiles, and small murmurs of delight. It was subtle yet pervasive, a lasting ripple that seemed to thread through everyone present. Jurors who had spent hours leaning forward in tense attention now exchanged subtle glances and quiet smiles. One juror, a man in his 50s, shook his head with gentle disbelief, whispering to his neighbor, "That little girl, she's changed the room." Another, a woman in her 40s, allowed a brief chuckle to escape, covering it quickly with her hand as she leaned forward, still engaged in the trial. Even those who had initially ignored the corner of the room now carried fragments of warmth, their minds touched by a moment of pure innocence. Emma's mother whispered softly to her daughter, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, "See, everyone is noticing how sweet you are." Emma smiled, pointing at Rex. "Doggy, look at me," she whispered. The dog responded immediately, obedient yet gentle, tilting his head slightly, ears forward. The simplicity of the interaction, clapping, pointing, soft whispers, was amplified by the attention it drew. Every small gesture carried significance, creating an unspoken bridge between child and dog, adults and their own suppressed humanity. Even the press took notice in a way that transcended normal coverage. Photographers snapped discreet images, journalists scribbled notes, and whispers of admiration rippled quietly through their ranks. "She's amazing," one whispered. "Just look at Rex responding to her." Another nodded, pen flying over pages as they recorded not only the trial, but also the remarkable human interest story unfolding quietly at the edge of the courtroom. The small moment, once overlooked, had grown into something unforgettable. The ripple Emma had started had now become a subtle, yet tangible wave of warmth. Courtroom staff, officers, clerks, and the stenographer exchanged soft smiles and shared looks that silently acknowledged the unusual but profound impact of this moment. The tension that had weighed heavily on the room for hours was softened, replaced by an undercurrent of humanity, empathy, and gentle joy. Even the lawyers, normally steely and impersonal in demeanor, found themselves stealing glances, some suppressing smiles, others letting brief, quiet laughter escape. As the session neared its conclusion for the morning, Emma leaned forward, whispering softly to Rex, "Good boy, you're the best doggy." The dog responded with the smallest tilt of his head, ears forward, attentive and patient. A few jurors chuckled quietly, and witnesses, no longer entirely tense, relaxed slightly in their seats. The moment was delicate yet powerful, a reminder that small acts of innocence could have profound emotional resonance. The courtroom, despite its weighty proceedings, had been transformed, briefly, beautifully, by a child's simple curiosity and a dog's disciplined presence. The judge called for a recess, and the sound of the gavel echoed through the room, but the warmth lingered. Emma waved shyly at Rex, who remained perfectly poised. Jurors exchanged knowing glances. Some whispered quietly to one another about the child and the dog. Witnesses left the stand with lighter expressions. Even the media, who had seen countless dramatic courtroom moments, were moved by the subtle power of what had transpired. Emma and Rex had reminded everyone that human connection and innocence could cut through tension, creating memories that would linger far beyond the trial. Emma's mother lifted her daughter slightly, whispering encouragement. "You made everyone so happy, sweetie. See, you and Rex are amazing." Emma's eyes sparkled as she looked back at the dog, clapping softly in quiet triumph. The dog responded with disciplined attentiveness, tail flicking lightly. It was a perfect, balanced interaction, child and animal, joy and discipline, warmth and calm, all unfolding against the serious backdrop of law and consequence. As the courtroom emptied slightly for recess, murmurs about Emma and Rex followed people into the hallways. Jurors quietly commented to one another about the unforgettable moment. Court staff shared smiles behind closed doors. Lawyers and witnesses discussed the small, heartwarming interlude in hushed tones, each recognizing the unique and powerful effect it had on everyone present. Emma's tiny gestures had created a ripple that extended far beyond her immediate corner of the room, leaving an invisible mark of joy and connection. The judge, returning to the bench after recess, allowed a small smile as he surveyed the room. The formality and structure of the trial remained, but he carried a quiet awareness of the human moment that had occurred. Emma and Rex had reminded him, and everyone present, that even in spaces of authority, rules, and high stakes, humanity could persist, bridging gaps and softening hearts. It was a rare gift, one that left the courtroom subtly transformed. By the end of the morning session, Emma's small presence had become part of the story itself. Jurors leaned back in their seats with lighter expressions. Witnesses spoke with more ease. Lawyers allowed themselves small, quiet smiles. Even the press, capturing images and writing notes, recorded not only the trial's events but also the quiet, unforgettable human story of a child, a dog, and the subtle joy they created. The courtroom had been transformed, not by grand gestures or dramatic testimony, but by the gentle power of innocence and the quiet, disciplined companionship of a K-9. Emma leaned on her mother's lap, sighing contentedly. Rex remained seated, calm, attentive, his presence steady and reassuring. The courtroom, now carrying traces of warmth and subtle laughter, felt fundamentally changed. What had begun as a simple observation from a curious child had grown into a shared human experience, touching hearts, softening expressions, and leaving an emotional resonance that would be remembered long after the trial concluded. And in that moment, everyone, from jurors to witnesses, court staff to attorneys, carried with them a memory of the quiet power of innocence, the unspoken bond between human and animal, and the simple joy that could quietly, profoundly, transform even the most serious of spaces. Emma's small act of pointing, clapping, and whispering had reminded the entire courtroom that, sometimes, the smallest gestures could create the most enduring impact.